Here today, we're going to be diving into how to optimally fuel yourself during those periods of high stress, whether that be for the student athletes, that finals week that's quickly approaching, whether just in general be a time period of life being a little stressful. Life is stressful. Or if we've got a stressful stretch of competition, if it's playoffs, whether it's kind of some back-to-backs, a tournament coming up on the weekend, what have you. We're going to discuss what that means nutritionally, what your body's going through, and how to be able to navigate that with food. And so during this type of week, a lot of things, again, can be coming up. You've got finals, you've got the tournaments, you have playoffs. Your training schedule during all this time likely hasn't really changed a whole lot amidst everything else that's still going on. So what starts to sometimes get sacrificed is sleep. That tends to be the first thing that gets cut in the long laundry list of all the obligations you have. And amidst all of that, the expectation is that your body is still supposed to perform optimally through all of that. Does that sound familiar? Like, is that kind of the week that's lined up, or are you familiar with having gone through that in the past? This is what we want to make sure that we start to be mindful of when those moments appear, how to navigate those. And so the problem with this entire kind of perfect storm that most people aren't talking enough about is the fact that many athletes are managing both the training stress and the school stress at the same time. Very rarely does this get talked about, though, together. They're usually compartmentalized where we're either diving into the training load stress or the life stressors, that kind of mental stress load. But when all of these things really start to stack on top of each other, that stress adds up. And internally, that stress gets picked up and interpreted in the same manner by the body, whether it be physical or cognitive. Stress is stress, internal. And the body needs to be able to overcome that. And so what the body is tapping into to be able to fuel everything and keep the body and the systems functioning optimally amidst all this is using the same energy tank. And so that's what we need to be mindful of to ensure that we don't all of a sudden kind of burn the candle at both ends and end up being super gassed, whether it be we can't think clearly come the actual test itself during finals week, or when we step out onto the field, we don't have the energy to go and perform as we know we should because of all these other stressors that have just been accumulating and we haven't been keeping up. And so internally, this is what's really kind of going on. When stress builds up, and when we think of stress, cortisol tends to be that first hormone that comes to everybody's mind, and for good reason, because cortisol is what the body is going to be releasing when we have that stress pop up. And whether it be from physical activity or mental and cognitive loads, that stress stimulates cortisol all the same. So internally, the body is still getting exposed to cortisol regardless of what's actually triggering it. And so when we think of this, in the short term, it's important to know that stress is good for the body. Stress is what sends that signal to the body to adapt. So especially when we're training, if we don't stress the body, we don't send the signal that we need to get stronger, we need to get faster, that we need to improve to be able to manage that stress. So in the short term, stress is great. Stress really helps us a whole lot. And it also, when we have a little bit of cortisol going into the body, it can raise our alertness, it can increase and improve our reaction time, but all of that is within context to where for a short term, that cortisol is great. If that cortisol lingers and lasts for an extended period of time though, that's when we start to get some issues. And that's typically the concept of cortisol that gets discussed and why cortisol gets such a bad reputation. Because in that context, when it's just a constant, nonstop flood of cortisol in the system, yeah, that's going to be detrimental. The body isn't able to process all of that. So all the hard work that you're putting in, the body's not reaping the benefits of it. It's kind of stopping being able to adapt because it's just trying to essentially survive. So the result of all that is you're continuing to do all this hard work, both cognitively of doing all that studying and physically. So you're doing all the training, you're doing all the lifts, but the body isn't responding as you would expect to. So kind of like a car, you're driving full steam ahead, but you've kind of got a foot on the brake a little bit. So it's still moving, but not optimally. And so we just want to be very mindful of all of that. So cortisol in the short term and in a relatively controlled situation, very beneficial, very helpful. We want to have it. When that cortisol and that stress just lingers and lasts forever, that's the negative side of it. That's what we want to make sure that we're avoiding. And so during all this stressful time, it's important to know that cognitively, your body and your brain are utilizing the same energy source, and primarily being glucose. So especially from the cognitive aspect of things, when we're studying for an exam or taking the test, the brain needs energy to be able to do all of that. And the big thing is going to be glucose. Glucose is going to be able to cross that blood-brain barrier to be able to fuel all of that. And so if we are constantly in a little bit of a stress state, the body is going to be struggling to navigate how to optimally use all of that glucose. And in general, when we think about just the energy demands, if we've got all of this cognitive load on top of the physical training load, that's a whole lot of energy that the body is trying to utilize. And so if we've got these two compartments that the body's trying to pull energy for, we need to ensure that there's enough energy for the body to actually pull from. And so one of the big things is, for individuals who are skipping breakfast, this is going to be incredibly detrimental, because right out of the gate in the morning, if you go to school, you're going to start learning. You're going to need that cognitive aspect. Or if you have morning training, when you go out onto the field, you need to be situational aware. You need to know what's the drill that's going on. How are the defenders in front of you reacting and responding? You need to be able to process information quickly. And if we skip breakfast, that means that fuel tank within the body has decreased. So now our brains and our bodies have less to pull from. And so what that means then is, as time goes on and during the stressful period, that energy deficit can start to accumulate. So we've got less and less and less energy available for our brains and for our bodies. So that cognitive side of things, you're going to think a little bit slower. Your reaction time is going to gradually be a little bit slower. You're not going to retain as much information or be able to pay as much attention in class. And then physically, out on the field, you're going to be fatigued a lot earlier. You're not going to be able to hit those high-speed sprints necessarily as much. And your just overall cardiovascular system is going to be taxed a lot more. You're going to feel as though you're hitting that wall a lot quicker. Just because, again, you're trying to run two systems on full speed, both utilizing the same energy tank. And if you're not fueling that appropriately, both sides are going to suffer. Now, when we're stressed, there's a lot of different kind of perceptions as to what the body does. And the biggest assumption is that during stressful periods, those junk food cravings really start to build up. But that's not actually what's occurring internally. What's really happening is that when we get in a stressed environment, we just stop being intentional about food. We don't necessarily start craving junk food as much as we notice our meal timing breaks down, the planning around our meals starts to disappear, and eating becomes a lot more reactive as opposed to being planned and structured. So what can happen is, if we are now all of a sudden throwing our typical routine and schedule out the window, we may notice that we're skipping meals, we may skip a snack, and what can then result is that hunger really starts to build. And when that hunger starts to build and accumulate, we then all of a sudden get a bigger appetite than what we typically would, or like our eyes become bigger than our stomachs. Because what happens then, when that hunger is increased and we go to actually start eating, it takes some time from the food that we consume to register with our brain that we're actually starting to get full. So in that time gap between consuming food and processing what we ate, we can eat a lot of food. And sometimes too, when we do get overly hungry, we don't really care what's in front of us. We just want to eat something, and we want to eat something now. And junk food tends to be something that, if we have it around, is always easily available. And so that's what the body can sometimes just reach for, grab for, and it's the perfect storm to where easy access and we're overly ravenous to where we just consume excess amounts of that junk food. And the other thing that occurs too with this is, because the body, both mentally and physically, are trying to tap in and utilize glucose, if we have our glucose drop too much, part of what that body signals to us is that naturally we need to eat. And so if we are gravitating towards some of those higher carb foods, but we're skipping out on some of the protein that the body actually needs, when we are under consuming protein as a whole, that can sometimes trigger and be interpreted as carb cravings. The body's trying to tell us that it needs to eat something. And in particular, it's trying to tell us that it needs some protein. But that message in the signal gets picked up and essentially misunderstood as being a carb/junk food craving. We've all been there. We all know the situation where if you get a bag of potato chips, you can eat the whole thing. And at the end of it, you're like, that wasn't as satisfying as I would have anticipated or expected. And it's because that's not what the body was asking for or craving. It was really needing some protein within the body. And so that's that perfect storm to where, again, more stress does not necessarily mean we're craving junk food. It's that cascade of events right there that results in that junk food intake kind of increasing as a result. So if we make sure that we keep the structure of everything together, we're going to be able to help avoid that. Then to add on top of that, the sleep aspect is really where recovery starts to fall. Because as we mentioned in the very beginning, when we have all these extra commitments going on and we have so much that we need to do in a day, sleep is what gets sacrificed. And that really hurts us because sleep is so important for literally every aspect of the body. But when we get busy, that's unfortunately what we default to pull back on. And so what we want to be very mindful of what we're now eliminating is being just cognitively aware of what sleep is actually doing for us. Sleep is when the body really starts to process everything, and it helps kind of hit the reset button, both internally and physically, like cognitively and physically. The biggest thing from a mental standpoint is when we sleep and we're getting that REM sleep, that's when the body is able to actually take the information that we learned during the day and store it in that long-term memory bank. That's what really helps us to be able to memorize and retain information, which is great during finals week. So if we're decreasing sleep and we're decreasing that retention, this is how that perfect storm in the scenario occurs where a lot of individuals will go cram the night before, take a test, get a decent grade sometimes, but then not remember anything the very next day. Because of this right there, the body wasn't set up in a manner to be able to actually retain that. And it doesn't do anybody good long term to where it's just you memorized a few things for 30 minutes and then all the benefit of it is now gone because you don't recall any of it. And so outside of the mental and the cognitive benefits of it, when we get that deep sleep, that's when the body is doing a lot of the physical repair and building. So if we are cutting into our sleep, now not only cognitively is this impacting us, now it's physically impacting us to where the muscles aren't going to be able to build that strength, where we're not going to be able to repair everything, to decrease that soreness, to feel good and go into the next day's training session feeling optimal. And so the research absolutely continues to support this across the board, that the more sleep you get, the better you're going to perform, the better you're going to recover. And again, every aspect of the body is going to reap a benefit of that. One thing to be mindful of too, though, is during this time period, if we are needing to stay up a little bit later, and nowadays this involves looking at computer screens to whether it be study, do some work, what have you, that screen time is absolutely going to interrupt your sleep quality. It's going to inhibit your ability to fall asleep, and it can inhibit your ability of getting that REM and deep sleep where a lot of those benefits take place. So again, just another thing that can really kind of compound is the perfect storm of we decrease our sleep time, we get extra screen time, which is going to decrease the quality of the sleep that we are getting, and it's just a vicious snowball effect. It's not to say that you aren't doing the right things during the day, to where even if you're eating the perfect food, you're doing the perfect training sessions, you're doing the perfect stretches and the physical recovery and rehab of everything, but if we're not getting the adequate sleep, we're not reaping as much of the benefits as we could. And so you're leaving a lot of benefit and a lot of gains on the table. And so when it comes to a food perspective, this is a time period where carbohydrates are going to actually matter more, not less. And so anytime that there's a very stressful week going on, people naturally try to think, okay, I want to try to make sure that my nutrition is on point to at least address that, to give myself the best chance to do as good as I can during the stretch of period. Unfortunately, that idea of eating cleaner starts to come at the expense of carbohydrates. Just due to messaging and social media and things like that, carbohydrates are taking a bit of a beating. But during this time period, carbohydrates are going to be even more important because carbohydrates, from a physical standpoint, fuel those intense activities, those explosive bursts of movement. We know that. If you're sprinting and things like that, the body's going to tap into some carbohydrates. Those explosive movements and things are stressors on the body. When we are in a stressed week, that internal stress, again, doesn't matter if it's cognitive stress, doesn't matter if it's physical stress, the body's going to respond in a similar way. So if our stress levels are high over the course of the entire day, the body is tapping into the carbohydrates a little bit more across that entire day. So now we need to make sure that we are offsetting that, or kind of being able to combat that better by ensuring that we're consuming adequate carbohydrates to navigate that. And for the student athletes, as you go throughout the entire day of your schoolwork, your classwork, and things like that, your body's burning a little extra carbohydrates the entire time. And now if we're pulling back on the carbohydrates that we're consuming, if we've got training still after class, we're now going into that with an even lower fuel tank than what we would normally. And that's absolutely going to set us up for kind of a disappointment, to where we're not going to be able to train as hard. We're not going to be able to perform as optimally as we know we could. And so if we get a less than stellar training session, that's going to be less adaptation that the body's going to get signaled for. And so we're not going to improve as much. So again, it's kind of that negative snowball aspect of things. So during this time period, it's very important to make sure that we don't pull back on carbohydrates and continue to ensure that we're consuming adequate amounts of them. The big thing with all this, though, is really just making sure that we're consuming enough overall. Across the board, total calories is always going to be essentially priority number one. We need to be giving the body the fuel and the energy that it needs to function, to perform. If we're not giving enough energy overall, things are going to start to fall to the wayside and get sacrificed. So it's not to say that just go have Cane's 24/7 and just get all your calories from that. Like, not saying that. But we do just want to make sure that before we stress out and add to the stressors of worrying about, well, should I have more carbs or protein or fat? What types of fats, what types of carbs and things? We just need to be eating. You need to be fueling your body. And so we want to make sure that we're getting adequate calories overall. Then protein is going to be kind of that next component that we really want to make sure that we stay on top of as well, because that protein piece is really going to help ensure that we're maintaining our muscle mass, we're maintaining the body composition, and by ensuring we're getting adequate protein, it helps decrease some of those cravings that may be popping up otherwise. But the challenge with all this is when we are stressed, that's when the schedule and meal structures and everything like that kind of blow up. That's when we can start to unintentionally skip meals, miss snacks, and it just sets us up in a situation where we unintentionally may be under-consuming and under-fueling our body. When we're under-fueled, we don't have enough to be able to help the brain function optimally. We're not going to have enough for our training sessions later in the day. And again, everything is going to be negatively impacted. So we want to make sure that we are protecting the overall structure, that we're protecting our overall meal schedule to ensure that we're consuming enough for the body overall. That total energy intake, again, is going to be priority number one. The other thing that we're going to want to be mindful of is our hydration levels. Dehydration is going to impact the body, just like sleep, in every aspect of the word. So a lot of times when we think of dehydration, the first thing that pops up are the physical effects of that, of some potential cramping, some heavy legs. We're not going to be sprinting as fast. We're going to feel fatigued a little bit quicker. It's going to increase soft tissue injury risk. The list goes on. And that's all true. But on top of that, that same amount of dehydration, that's relatively small, just a 2% loss of overall body weight from fluid, is enough to trigger cognitive decline. And when we are trying to perform physically and mentally, that dehydration is going to impact us across the board with everything. And so when our routine is messed up and we're not consuming food adequately, we're also likely not drinking enough adequately. And it just, again, continues to compound and compile all the negatives that start to pop up. So just as we need to make sure that we've got a schedule and a cadence for our meals, we need to make sure that we're doing our due diligence to stay on top of our hydration as well. So whether that be setting up a little bit more of a structured schedule for you, or just setting a little phone reminder to have it go off regularly and let you know, hey, it's been a while, I need to make sure that I'm getting something to drink. We need to stay on top of the hydration to allow the body to continue to perform just as optimally as well. Now, not to get too into the weeds of things, but one nutrient that was worth mentioning is magnesium. Magnesium is something that quietly starts to kind of get depleted when the body is in a stressed state. And already, before even worrying about the stress aspect of things, magnesium is something that the vast majority of us just aren't consuming enough of through food alone. And so if we now are in a stress state where we're losing extra magnesium, we haven't been consuming enough of it, and also too, with the increased overall training and some sweat losses that are going to accumulate that magnesium loss, we've got a whole lot of things decreasing the magnesium within the body. And so when that starts to occur, magnesium is involved in a whole lot of pathways within the body, one of which being helping to manage the cortisol levels within the body. And so if we are deficient and just low in magnesium overall because of all these different factors, as we have this extra stress starting to build up, we have a weaker system to be able to combat that. So everything that cortisol triggers is now amplified. So we want to be very mindful and on top of our magnesium intake. If that means a supplement, okay, we can do that, but we just want to make sure that we're being consistent with that. The first step that I would recommend though, is just ensuring that you're consuming magnesium-rich foods. The big ones are going to be spinach, pumpkin seeds, nuts, beans, and whole grains. Those are going to be things that you are really going to want to emphasize and ensure that you're including in your diet regularly during these stressful periods. And so during these high stress weeks, this is kind of a breakdown of the overall plan of that little checkbox of what should we be focusing on, what should we be emphasizing to continue to put our best foot forward. Priority number one, carbohydrates. We want to make sure that we're keeping carbs in, especially around training. With the high stress, the body's going to be tapping into those carbohydrate stores a little bit more, and we want to ensure that we have enough on hand for it. The other thing is meal timing, making sure that we're eating on a schedule. Don't let the stressors and just the craziness of everything derail that to where all of a sudden, next thing you know, it's been 8 hours since we've had our last meal. We need to ensure that we're consuming enough. That total energy intake is going to be incredibly important, which ties into, again, that third part, total calories. Protect the total calories before worrying about anything else. If the body isn't getting enough energy, period, it's not going to adapt to the training as well. The brain's not going to have enough energy to be able to help cognitively, and we're gonna have a bad time. So make sure that we've got that schedule, we're getting total calories, make sure we've got some carbohydrates in there. Then sleep. You need to protect sleep. Just like you've got your practice time and your game time scheduled where you're not going to miss it, try and schedule your sleep time with just as much importance. We need to prioritize that. We need to protect that as best we can because that's really where you're going to reap a whole lot of your benefits. Then hydration. We should always be mindful of our hydration to be able to avoid dehydration from a cognitive aspect of things, from a soft tissue injury aspect of things, and performance decrement. We need to stay on top of that. But when we get stressed and we get super busy, just like our meal timing can go kind of out the window, so too can our focus on hydration. We don't realize it, but we could go an entire day without having touched a water bottle. That can't happen. And so whatever system you need to implement for yourself, whether it's setting those reminders or what have you, we need to make sure that that's in place to keep you hydrated to be able to do everything optimally. And then if we're checking all those boxes, magnesium is going to be something worth looking into as well. Making sure that you've got at least one magnesium-rich food every single day. If supplementation is needed and appropriate, making sure that we're taking it consistently. But these are all the things. As that stress builds, all of these things become even more important, and we need to ensure that we protect them. And so here this week, I challenge you to just pick one of those things. You by no means need to do every single thing on that list. And that's where overwhelm and just kind of things start to fall between the cracks, begins to occur. You've already got enough on your plate. Everything listed on there was to help navigate a stressful week. It's probably not going to help a stressful week if we say, now you need to focus on these extra 7 things. Pick one, whichever one you feel resonates best for you, and focus on that for 7 days. Let that build into a little bit more of a habit, and once you get into a groove with it, then we can focus and try and incorporating a second one. We don't need to blow everything up. We don't need to start from scratch with everything. You're doing a lot of great things. Now we just need to make sure we're fine-tuning and tweaking things to accommodate the extra stress that's accumulating there. So here are some common questions kind of around the topic that have generally popped up in discussions that I've had with other athletes. First one being, do athletes need to eat more during stressful training periods? This is not necessarily the case. So while yes, when we are stressed, the metabolism can increase a little bit, but not a ton to where we need to feel as though we need to eat an entire extra meal or anything like that. We just need to be very mindful that we're not skipping meals. We need to ensure that we're consuming enough total calories to just keep the body fueled, to keep everything functioning optimally, to allow us to do everything that we're asking the body to do. We certainly want to prioritize some carbohydrates, make sure we've got protein in there, and prioritize the hydration aspect of things as well. But as far as do we need to eat more total food? No, not necessarily. Then why does stress reduce appetite in athletes? This is where cortisol comes into play. Cortisol can suppress hunger signals, and that is a very real and a very noticeable feeling that the vast majority of individuals in these situations feel and experience. That's why when we get too locked in and kind of focused on everything, we've got that stress running high, how we can miss meals, how we can miss snacks. And that's what we want to be very careful and cautious to make sure that we don't let happen to us. So whether it's setting reminders or whatever that is, we need to make sure that we are protecting our meal times to ensure that we're consuming adequate calories in general to fuel the body. Because as soon as we start missing meals, as soon as we start missing snacks, that's kind of that first domino that falls down, and a cascade of events can really start to build and accumulate, and we have a lot of negatives then as a result down the line. Then, how is nutrition during a high stress period different from normal training nutrition? And it comes back to quite a few different ways, but a big thing is that overall carbohydrate utilization. When the body is under extra stress, it's going to tap into those carbohydrate stores a little bit more. So we want to make sure that we are providing those carbohydrates to be able to help manage that a little bit better. We also then want to make sure that we're just consuming adequately. That's the biggest thing, because if it's just training alone that we have, it's a little bit less of a stressor. We don't have the added cognitive stress of everything going on. So it's a little bit easier for us to stay mindful and intentional about when we're eating, when we're drinking. And we need to make sure then that in those high stress periods, we're implementing systems to be able to avoid any of that falling between the cracks. So whether it be the reminders or what have you, we just need to ensure that there's a plan to be able to account for all of that and ensuring that we're meeting all of the cognitive demands and the physical demands across the board.